Hey guys, welcome back to Things Above, where we are seeking the things that are above. We are setting our minds on the things that are above because we don't want to give ourselves to the things of this earth, to the things that will not last. We want to give ourselves to that which does, to that which is eternal. We want to be like Jesus and not be like this world. So that's the gist of this channel. I'm glad that you've landed here. If you haven't done this yet, go ahead and like and go ahead and subscribe. So we're now moving through the book of Nehemiah, and last week we opened that up and we looked at chapter 1. I'll give you a quick recap because it's hard to dive into chapter 2 without going back and looking at where we have been. So where we've been is this place where Nehemiah, he's chilling in this Persian resort town where these Persian kings would relax, and it's called Susa. And so he's there in the fortress. He's the cupbearer of the king Artaxerxes. And so he's there, but he gets wind of what's been happening down in Jerusalem. See, this is at the time, this is about 450 BC, somewhere around there. And what's happened is the people of God had been led into exile by Babylon, and Persia had overtaken Babylon. And so now they're being ruled, their land is being ruled by the Persians. And so they have, though, the Persians allowed the Jewish people, the Israelites, to go back into the land of Judah, into Jerusalem itself, but only about 50,000 people have done that. Most of the people are quite comfortable where they are, but some of the people that have done that, they return, they come and visit him, and they give him this report that the walls of Jerusalem have been torn down, the gates have been destroyed by fire. And upon receiving this news, it just hits him really hard. He begins to weep, and he mourns, and he fasts, and he prays, right? And he's moved. He wants to do something about this. And so we actually have one of those prayers that he prayed recorded in Nehemiah chapter 1. That's what we looked at last week. I'm not going to move all the way through that thing, but at the tail end, what he's really praying for is that God would give him an audience with the king, that the king would show mercy to him, that the king whom he serves would allow him to go back to Jerusalem and do something about the mess that has been made of the walls and the gates of the city. And of course, and we talked about this last week, anytime in the Old Testament that you're looking at the physical state of things, then you're also talking about, that's an image of what's going on spiritually for the people of God. So if the walls and the gates and the temple and all of those things have been destroyed, by this time the temple has been rebuilt. But if things are physically bad, then things are definitely spiritually bad as well. And so he wants to do something about that. The tail end of his prayer, I'll touch on these three things that we talked about again. He comes to God, one, in humble reliance, right? He comes to God saying, I want to do something about this, but I know, God, I can do nothing apart from you. And that's how we all should be coming to God in prayer. The second thing that he does is he says, I delight in honoring you. Like all of my prayers, all of the things that I desire in this life, they revolve not around me, but around you, God, right? Everything that I'm doing, I want to do in order that I might please you, in order that I might lift up your name, right? And then thirdly, we saw that Nehemiah, he prays this prayer, but he doesn't pray it expecting like God to do everything. He prays saying, God, whatever you need me to do, wherever you want to fit me into the resolution, like whatever you need me to do to help you restore that city and restore your people, I'm here, I'm at your disposal. And so we learned several things about how we ourselves should come before God in prayer, especially when our world is falling apart. And chances are, wherever you are in the world, because of this COVID and because of everything else that is happening at this moment, you're probably like me and like everybody else. There's a little bit of suffering, there's a little bit of chaos, there's a part of you that wants things to get back to the way that they were before. But as we move through this, we don't merely want that, right? we don't want to just rebuild the things that have been torn down. We also want to be constantly and forever, we want to be rebuilding our very lives, rebuilding our very hearts. And so that's why we're moving through this letter. So at times, we're going to see here in chapter 2, we're going to see God's response to Nehemiah's prayer back there in chapter 1. And at times, God, when he responds to our prayers, it looks like this parting of the Red Sea, right? I'm here, I have answered you, and I've made this answer visible to all people that can see it, that are here to see the sea parting, right? So at times he answers prayers in that way, but most of the time, I would say, and this is definitely true in my own life, he answers prayer the way that we're going to see him answer the prayer of Nehemiah here in chapter 2. So I'm excited about this. Let's go ahead and jump in chapter 2, starting here at verse 1. He writes, "Early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine." That's what cupbearers do, right? That means he tasted it before he served. He says, "I had never before appeared sad in his presence. So the king asked me, 'Why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled.' And then I was terrified." And the reason he's terrified is because whenever you're in the presence of the king, you're not supposed to be sad, right? Just his very presence is supposed to warm your heart, to lift you up, right? There can be no sadness when he is around. So he's terrified because he could be punished just for the expression that he's wearing here on his face. He continues, "Then I was terrified, but I replied, 'Long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire.'" So it's easy to miss this, but maybe the most significant part of that part of this text is the fact that it gives us this time frame. It tells us about when these things are taking place. And so Nehemiah chapter 1, his prayers, his mourning, his fasting, those begin in the fall and the winter. And now we've moved on to spring. And so we know that he's been praying about this for 4 months now. And so the question is, why has he waited until now to act, right? That's the question before us. And I think the answer to this question is this. Because he wants to spend all the time that he can bringing this before God, because he wants to ensure that this is of God and that it's not of Nehemiah, that this is God's will and it's not simply some desire of the heart of Nehemiah that doesn't align with what God would have him do. So another way to simplify that, we'll put it like this. The more we bring something to God, the more clear it becomes whether or not it is of him, right? And so I just this week, we have a fall break coming up for our kids at school. And so every fall break is at least one time a year that we want to get away from the hustle and bustle of Bangkok. If you lived here, you'd want to get away from time to time too. And so we're going to go to this place. We've booked the hotel, this place called Kanchanaburi, and this is where the famous River Kwai is. If you've seen that movie, we're going to be on that bridge, right? And so I booked that place, but immediately, and this is something that happens from time to time, it was non-refundable, but I booked it, and then immediately my wife and I were looking at the place, we're comparing it to other places, something you should never do, all right, after you already booked one place that is not refundable, right? So we're immediately second guessing ourselves. We're saying, man, is this really the best place? Was this really the best price? I'm comparing breakfast. I'm comparing the views from the room. I'm like, man, I just don't know. And then I have to move beyond that stage and get to this place where, because it's non-refundable, I have to convince myself that I'm really, really happy with the decision that I impulsively made. I share all that to say that our prayers should not look like that. Like, we should not just impulsively go to God or impulsively respond thinking that he's already answered a prayer that he has not answered yet, but so often in my life, that's exactly what it looks like. I'm like, man, I just prayed about this, and 2 minutes later, God gave me a sign. I just prayed about this, and the very next day, somebody came into my life and they spoke to the very thing that I prayed to Him about, right? And we can be very impulsive, and we can be very quick, and we can not be sometimes very patient and end up waiting on God the way that Nehemiah does here. And here's the thing, if we don't love this hotel, it's not really a big deal. It's still a 4-star place. It'll be pretty nice, I'm sure. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that significant. But here's the problem with prayer. If we impulsively react, if we impulsively just say, okay, well, God answered that prayer. It's only been a couple of minutes. It's only been a couple of days. I'm gonna go forward. The consequences of doing that are far greater than they are of just booking a hotel a little too fast. Would you agree with that, right? The consequences of thinking that He has answered a prayer and moving too quickly are unhealthy relationships, are jobs that we should have never stepped into, financial hardships that we've entered into because we made a rash decision that we should not have made. We should have bathed things in prayer, and the list goes on and on. So again, we need to be bringing things before God frequently and day after day after day, and it could even in this case, it could be months on end before we can really hear from Him, right? And so we need to learn this art that Nehemiah practices here. All right, so he goes on now in verse 4. The king asked, well, how can I help you? Can you feel the relief? He was terrified, and at that, Nehemiah, he just, right? He can breathe again. The king is sympathizing with his situation. He continues, with a prayer to the God of heaven. There he is praying again. I replied, if it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked, how long will you be gone? And when will you return? After I told him how long I would be gone, the king agreed to my request. So the line that jumps out to me is the line that I alluded to. It's that line about prayer right after the king asks, what can I do for you? How can I help you? Right before Nehemiah responds to that, he tells us, I prayed to the God of heaven. And I find that very significant. I find that very telling. I find that representative of the attitude that all of us should have and the lifestyle that we should be living out. Like, this is how prayerful you and I should be every day of our lives, as prayerful as Nehemiah is here, taking this tiny time out, this little time out to pause before he responds. I think he offers some thanksgiving up to God, and I think he wanted to ask God that his request would be granted, right? And he just takes this little moment to lift this up and give this to God. And so it teaches us this, that there's never a moment where our God in heaven is not attentive to our pleas here on earth. And so we would really do well to learn to tap into this, to be more cognizant, to be more aware of his presence, and like take advantage of that, to be with him, to go to him. So in our own lives, my wife and I, we've decided we spend entirely too much time behind screens, right? And so one thing that we've done, and this especially affects our children, because our children, they've begun to complain about that. They've begun to have conversations with us about this. And there are times, this happens day after day after day, where they ask, Mom, Dad, can you get off your phone? Like, can you talk to me? Can you play with me? Can we go and do something? I don't know what you're doing, but I'm here and you're not present with me. And so we've taken to getting this little box. And when we pick the kids up from school and we arrive home, we put the phones in that box, and the phones do not come out of that box until they go to bed, right? And so this is something that we just started. It's this new practice that is helping us to be more present with them, right? But here's what I want to do. As I think about that and I look at what Nehemiah does here, I also want to say, man, God is with us every bit of the time. Like he is always here. He doesn't go off to school and we can play with our phones when he's at school. He's always present. We always have him. He's always attentive to our needs and our prayers and our concerns, right? And we need to learn how to be more present with him, right? And to be going to him, to not make prayer something that we do 1 or 2, 3 times a day at certain times of the day. It has to be something that we're doing. We have this constant conversation with God. I think that's what Nehemiah had going on in his life, and that's what I want for me, and that's what I would hope for you. All right, let's continue. I also said to the king, if it please the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. And please give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for a house for myself. And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. So what we learn here is that as Nehemiah was weeping and mourning and fasting and praying over that 4-month period, there's something else that Nehemiah was doing. He was also engaged in some planning. He was making preparations, right? He was thinking about and organizing his thoughts. What am I going to do if God allows me to go down to Jerusalem and rebuild those walls, right? He's thinking about all these things that he needs. It reminds me this story several years ago. There was a young man who was applying for colleges and he was trying to get into some pretty good ones. And he's like, Matt, would you pray for me as I prepare to take these really important tests? I'm like, yeah, absolutely, man. I'll anytime you want me to bathe something in prayer that will honor God and bring glory to him, I'm happy to do that. And I asked him, are you praying about this as well? And he said, absolutely, night and day. That's what I'm doing. I'm on my knees in prayer. Yes, I'm giving this over to God. And I said, and you've went out and got some of those resources, some of those books, some of those online materials that will help you to prepare for this test. Like you've got some things to study as well. Is that right? And he's like, no. Like I haven't done that at all. I'm simply praying and I'm not doing any studying, right? And how do you think that was going to work out for him? Yeah, not very well. It's not a good idea. There are situations, there are some times where the only thing that we can do is pray, right? But often we can do something too, right? We can make some plans, we can do some preparing. There are things that we can do that when God answers the prayer, we're ready to take the next step, right? And the next step isn't just more prayer. We do see Nehemiah doing that, but the next step is to actually say, well, here are the things that I need. That's what we see Nehemiah giving to the king when he says, what can I do for you? How can I help you? We have to be ready. We have to prepare and not simply just pray, as important as prayer is. Here's the other thing that I underline in this portion is why he was able to do this. Why did the king grant his request? He says, because the gracious hand of God was upon me, right? And so there's the reason that you and I can do anything that we do in the kingdom of God. It is only by his grace, only by his mercy, only because he has had compassion on us that we're able to do anything that we might do for his kingdom, for his glory, right? And so Nehemiah, he's not looking at this and telling the people, it was because of my great planning, it was because of all these preparations that I made that I was able to have the king grant my request. Nehemiah is not saying he granted my request because I, Nehemiah, I am the man, right? No, he's saying God is the man, and that's why this request has been granted. All right, so he goes on now in verse 9. When I came to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, I delivered the king's letters to them. The king, I should add, had sent along army officers and horsemen to protect me. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of my arrival, they were very displeased that someone had come to help the people of Israel. And here's what's crazy. Sanballat and Tobiah, those are both Hebrew names. Don't be fooled by the fact that one is a Horonite and one is an Ammonite. Both of these dudes have Israelite roots. They have Israelite genes. They have Israelite names, right? And so these people are the kinds of people that should be on board with what Nehemiah is doing, but rather than doing that, they oppose him, they stand against him. And here's an important lesson that we learn from this. Even when the hand of God is upon you, you will still face opposition. And if you've been walking with Christ long enough, then you know that. You've experienced that. If you haven't been walking with him very long, or you're brand new to this whole thing, don't think that you're just going to step into this, that you're going to put your faith in Christ. You're going to be trusting in him for your salvation, and everything in this world is going to get easier. I would argue that, and Jesus would argue this, in most cases, it's going to get harder. There's going to be opposition, and sometimes, yes, it's even going to come from within. All right, now, in verses 11 through 15, I'm not going to read those. You can go ahead and read that section yourself, but here's what happens. He describes this kind of reconnaissance mission, right? So he comes into Jerusalem, he arrives, the big moment, the thing that he prayed for, he's there, and he takes a couple of trusted men with him, but he doesn't tell anybody else, and he goes around the walls and the gates of Jerusalem, right? And he's surveying the damage. In fact, it says 2 times in those verses that he is doing some inspecting. And the original word in the Hebrew, that word is actually more of a medical term that they would have used to describe what the doctor is doing when he's probing a wound to see the extent of the damage. And so this is what Nehemiah is doing. He's probing the walls, he's probing the gates, he's gathering information, right? He's assessing things so that he knows what are the next steps that we have to take. All of these materials that I've brought with me, where am I going to have to use all of these things that I've brought? What's the damage? He continues, verse 16 now. The city officials did not know I had been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. So, again, he does nothing in haste, right? He doesn't do anything quickly or impulsively. He says, I'm going to need all of these people to help me. I'm not going to rebuild this thing alone, right? But I'm not going to tell them until I've seen firsthand the damage, until my heart that's already been aching about this, until my heart is melted by what I see firsthand. And once that happens, then now I can go ahead and report to them why I have come and what all that timber's about, right? So he continues now in verse 17. But now I said to them, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. And then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and about my conversation with the king. So I love what he does here, because he doesn't make this a Nehemiah problem. It's not just something that's very personal to him, even though it is. He says this is a collective problem. He doesn't use I, he uses we. So here in Bangkok, we have power outages all the time. And sometimes it's a case where it's just our house, and sometimes it's the whole neighborhood. So when it's just our house, we'll walk up to some friends in the neighborhood, we'll text them, and we'll be like, hey man, is the power out where you are? And they'll be like, no. Is it out at your house? And they're like, yeah, it's been out. I've tried the fuse box, I've tried everything. I don't know when exactly it's going to come back on or what I can do about it. And when it's not their problem, what do they say? They say, oh, that's a bummer, right? That stinks because it's not their problem. But what happens when the power is out in the whole neighborhood? What happens is you walk outside and the whole neighborhood is outside, and half the neighborhood now thinks that they are electricians, right? That they're going to go ahead and solve this problem. They're going to find the transformer, they're going to find the broken wire, and they're going to fix it, right? So when it's everybody's problem, everybody wants to fix it. But when it's just your problem, well, nobody else wants to fix it. And so he makes sure to say, this is a collective problem. This is everybody's problem. And by the way, it's not just about us. It's a disgrace to our God, right? It's a disgrace to his very name. And so, guys, we've got to come together and we've got to fix this. We've got to rebuild these walls. We've got to rebuild these gates, and we've got to bring the security back to God's people. And if, again, things are in a better physical state, then that helps us to get back to a better spiritual state, right? So it's not just a matter of their vulnerability, but it's also a matter of their relationship with God, and it's a matter of his name being lifted up, because right now, with his people living like this, it's not a good look for him. All right, he continues. They replied at once, let us rise up and build. And so they began the good work. Chapter 3, he records the beginnings of this work, that concerted collective effort that the people of God begin to make to rebuild those walls and those gates. Okay, so what's the application for us? Because here's the thing, God's name is not at stake in a particular city today, like Jerusalem, right? There aren't physical walls that are protecting the people of God today. Right? So if we're going to rise up and we're going to build something together, if we're going to rise up and we're going to exert ourselves towards some common end, what would that end be? And to answer that question, let me jump over to the New Testament and look at a couple of things that the Apostle Paul says. First, we go to Ephesians, where he writes, now these are the gifts Christ gave to the church, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and the pastors and teachers. Their responsibility is to equip God's people to do his work and build up the church, the body of Christ. This will continue until we all come to such unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. Right? So in Nehemiah, these guys, again, chapter 3, they begin the process of erecting an actual wall and fixing some gates, right? But what we're doing is we're called to rise up and build up one another, to build up the church. And here's the end. Here's why we all need to help one another to become more like Christ. To this end, he writes here in 2 Corinthians 5. For God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this message of reconciliation. And so we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. So now it's not about building this wall that protects us, makes us less vulnerable from our enemies, right? We have Jesus Christ that protects us. We have his blood upon us, right? So it's not about that. What is it about? Well, now it's about building up one another into the likeness of Christ. It's about tearing down walls that stand, all the barriers that stand between us and our enemies, and taking the gospel to them, and taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. And when people receive the gospel, when they believe, when they put their faith in Christ and they begin to follow him, when there is a response, that's when God's name is lifted up. That's how we make sure that his name is not in disgrace, right? That's what it looks like today. That's the application that we can take from this part of Nehemiah, this idea of rebuilding. All right, I do want to get back to Nehemiah and wrap this thing up. So I want you to look here now at verse 19 and 20. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arabs, so there's a third dude opposing them now, when they heard of our plan, they scoffed contemptuously. What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They asked. I replied, the God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding this wall, but you have no share, no legal right, and no historic claim in Jerusalem. So there's some irony here, right? Because these guys, they think that they're on the side of the king, but actually Nehemiah is on a mission right now that the king has put him on, right? Like he requested this and the king granted it. He has the king's orders. He could just pull those out of his bag and say, look at this, check this out. This is the mission that he sent me on. But he doesn't even bother with that, because even if the king were opposed to the thing that he's doing, Nehemiah says, well, my God is for it. Our God is for it. And so therefore, it doesn't even matter what this king might think, right? And so he goes on and says, you guys have no lot. This is really, it has nothing to do with you. No share, no legal right, no historical claim. And remember, these people, they have the genes of the people of God, right? They are Israelites at their core, right? But they have decided to care not about the people of Israel, not about the things of God. They've joined the world, right? And that's why they oppose what Nehemiah and this team of people are doing, right? Because they're worldly and not heavenly minded, right? And so here's the point that I want to make about the culture and how we respond to a culture. Because wherever you are in the world, I happen to be in a 96% Buddhist culture. Wherever you happen to be, chances are you live in a culture that opposes the gospel, that opposes the kingdom of God, and that wants to exert influence over you. And so Nehemiah shows us here how to respond to that, right? So let's say it like this. The world has no say in what we're doing in God's kingdom. When I read the news, when I look at the culture, when I look at the church, and when I look at the church giving into the culture, when I look at the church becoming more like the world around it, it really concerns me, because it's the opposite of what we see here. Nehemiah, he stands up to the culture. Daniel, who was living in the same time, he stood up. His friends stood up to the culture around them, to the people that would oppose them, right? They did not simply cave in. They did not simply say, okay, there's a secular movement. We're going to go ahead and be good people and join whatever secular movements are happening now. We have to learn to do this. We have to learn to stand up, to rise up and build in the face of the culture, to not take our cues from the culture, to not say, okay, if there's a movement going on around me, I better be quick to join that. No, because there's a movement of God, right? There's a building up of his body. There is a taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. There is living every moment, breathing every breath for the glory of God. And that's the one thing that you and I should be participating in at all costs. And so I just encourage you, if you find yourself in this culture, if you find yourself surrounded by these kinds of people, the Sanballats, the Tobiahs, and the Geshems of the world. Remember, the gracious hand of God is upon you. The Spirit of God is within you, and Jesus himself goes before you, right? There's nothing to fear. Don't cave in. Don't give into the world. Don't become more like it. Stand for the things of God. Stand on the promises of God. Guys, thanks for joining me again. Next week we'll tackle, I believe, Nehemiah chapter 4. I'll see you next week.